I live in Italy, not in Rome, not in Florence. In the south, in the hills where most of your families came from. Last month I was standing in a small shop in the province of Avellino in Campania. An old man ahead of me ordered a few slices of cured pork. He said the name of it the way his father said it and the way his grandfather said it before that. He did not say capicuollo. He said something very close to GABAGOOL. He is 81 years old. He has never left Italy. He has never met an Italian-American in his life. Your grandfather was not saying it wrong. If you grew up in an Italian-American house, you already know the sound of that word. You do not have to be told what it means. It lives somewhere under the ribs. Maybe it was a Saturday morning. Maybe your father was driving and you were in the front seat and the two of you pulled up outside the deli on the corner. The bell over the door, the smell of provolone and vinegar and sawdust, the glass case with the trays lined up in rows, and your father leaned on the counter and said, "Half a pound of gabagool." Nobody in that store thought it was strange. The man behind the counter did not correct him. He reached in, pulled out the whole piece, and set the slicer humming. Then years went by, and at some point somebody corrected you. Maybe it was a teacher. Maybe it was a college roommate who had spent a semester in Florence and came back with opinions. Maybe it was a waiter in a nice restaurant, the kind with the leather menus, who repeated your order back to you slowly, with a smile that was not really a smile. "It's capicola. Actually, it's capicuollo," and something small closed up inside you. You started saying it their way. You started ordering it the way it was printed on the sign. I want to tell you today very plainly that you did not have to do that. Here is what is actually happening inside that word. The languages of southern Italy are not broken versions of Italian. They are their own languages, with their own rules, older in some cases than the Italian they were later measured against. And Neapolitan, the language of Naples and the country around it, has a habit that linguists have written about for a very long time. The hard consonants soften. They go from sharp to round. Specialists call it voicing. C becomes G. P becomes B. T becomes D. So take the word as it is written in standard Italian, capicuollo. Now let it pass through the mouth of a man from Campania. The first C rolls over into a G. The second C rolls over into a G. The last sound falls away because it always falls away, and we will come back to that. Gabagool. That is not a mispronunciation. That is a rule. That is a system working exactly the way it is supposed to work. Your great-grandfather never studied that rule. He never saw it written down. He did not need to. He followed it the way you follow the rules of English, without ever once thinking about them. He opened his mouth and the language came out correctly because it was his language and he owned it. Then he got on a ship. He carried it 3,000 miles across the ocean. He handed it to his son. His son handed it to your father. Your father handed it to you in the front seat of a car outside a deli on a Saturday morning. And a waiter with a leather menu told you it was wrong. To understand why that happened, you have to understand something about Italy that most Americans are never taught. Italy became one country in 1861. That is not very long ago. There are houses in the town where I live that are older than the country itself. Before 1861, this was not one place. It was kingdoms and duchies and papal territory. The south, where your family came from, was the kingdom of the two Sicilies, ruled from Naples. It had its own courts, its own army, its own coins, and its own language. When the new Italy was assembled, the government had to choose a national language. They chose Tuscan, the language of Florence, of Dante, of the books. Now, that was a reasonable choice for literature, but it meant that on the day Italy was born, the official language of the country was a language most of the people in the country did not speak at home. Historians still argue about the exact numbers. Some scholars put the figure very low. Others say it was higher. I am not going to give you a number and pretend it is settled because it is not settled. But no serious historian disputes the direction of it. In 1861, the people who actually spoke standard Italian in daily life were a minority, In the villages of the South, they were a very small minority indeed. Your great-grandparents did not fail to learn Italian. Italian, as a spoken everyday thing, had barely arrived where they lived. It came later, with the schools, with the radio, and above all with television in the 1950s and 60s. By then, your family had already been in America for 50 years. They left before the change. They took the old language with them and they kept it, out on the other side of the ocean, while back home it was slowly being replaced. So when you say gabagool, you are not speaking bad Italian. You are speaking good Neapolitan from the year 1905. Let me take you to the ground it came from, because I think you should see it. The province of Avellino sits inland from Naples, not on the coast. You do not see the sea from there. The old name for the area is Irpinia, and the people are called Irpini, from a very old word for the wolf. It is hill country. Chestnut woods on the slopes. Stone towns standing on the ridges, built high up because of bandits and malaria in the valleys. In winter, it snows. In August, the light comes down white and hard, and the whole place goes quiet in the afternoon. The towns have names your family may have said at the kitchen table without ever showing you on a map. Calitri, Bisaccia, Sant'Angelo dei Lombardi, Montella, Gesualdo, Mirabella e Clano, Lioni, Monteverde, Ariano Irpino. This was one of the poorest corners of the kingdom, and then one of the poorest corners of Italy. The land is beautiful, and it is stubborn. Thin soil, steep fields, hard winters. A family fed itself on wheat, beans, chestnuts, a pig once a year, and whatever the garden gave. And in the years around 1900 it emptied. Not slowly, not gently, whole streets went. A man left, and then his brother, and then his cousin, and then the boy from the house across the alley who did not want to be the last one standing there. Roughly 4 million Italians arrived in the United States between 1880 and 1920. The great majority came from the South. Campania, and the province of Avellino in particular, sent them by the thousands. If you are watching this in New Jersey or in Queens or outside of Philadelphia, there is a real chance that the ridge I am describing is where your name comes from. Now let me tell you what that meat actually is, because most people who eat it every week have never been told. Capicuollo comes from 2 words, capo, which means head, collo, which means neck. It is the muscle that runs from the base of the skull down through the neck and into the top of the shoulder of the pig. It is a working muscle, so it has flavor, and it is threaded through with fat, in thin ribbons, not in one solid block. That is why a slice held up to the light looks like a piece of stone with veins running through it. That is why it goes soft on the tongue instead of chewy. In the province of Avellino, the old people call it capicuollo. Same word, older shape. In Naples, you will hear capicuollo and capicuollo. Go down into Calabria and you will hear capicuodo. Cross into Puglia and it changes again. Every province filed the edges off it a little differently. The version your family knew was almost certainly the Campanian one. Salt, black pepper, cracked coarse, not powdered. In some houses, a little wild fennel seed. In some houses, a splash of red wine rubbed into the surface. In some houses, and this depended entirely on the family, a red dusting of dried sweet pepper. That is the whole recipe. Meat, salt, pepper, thyme, and cold air. There is nothing in it that had to be bought. Everything in it came off the farm or out of the cupboard. That is not a coincidence. That is the entire reason the dish exists. And notice what is not in it. No sugar, no smoke in the Campanian version. No 20 ingredients. Poor food is not simple because the cook lacked imagination. Poor food is simple because there was nothing else in the house. Now put yourself back at the table. Sunday. Somebody's grandmother's house. The plastic on the good furniture in the front room, which nobody was allowed to sit on. The smell of the sauce, which had been going since 7 in the morning. And before anything else came out, there was a plate. You know the plate. Cold cuts fanned in a circle, provolone cut in wedges, black olives, roasted peppers in oil with a little garlic floating in it, maybe some celery, maybe a few pieces of finocchio. And on that plate, the gabagool, folded, never laid flat. There was an order to it that nobody ever explained. You did not put the sweet next to the sharp. You did not let the provolone touch the peppers. Somebody in that family knew the rules and enforced them without saying a word about why. And there was always the moment when a small child reached for the plate too early and got their hand smacked gently with a wooden spoon. That plate was not an appetizer. Not really. In America, it turned into an appetizer because in America there was enough food for a first course and a second course and a third. Where your family came from, that plate was often the meal. A few slices of what came out of the cellar, a piece of hard cheese, bread, and that was supper for a grown man who had been in the field since dawn. Your grandmother put out that plate every Sunday for 30 years in a house in Brooklyn or Newark or Waterbury. And she never once explained to you that she was setting down on a table in America the exact supper her mother used to set down on a table in a stone house on a hill. She probably did not think it needed explaining. Come back to the word for a minute, because there is a second thing happening in it, and you hear it in 20 other words you grew up with. The ending disappears. Mozzarella becomes mozzarella. Prosciutto becomes prosciutto. Ricotta becomes rigat. Bracciola, which is a thin slice of meat rolled around a filling, becomes braciole. Calamari becomes calamad. Manicotti becomes manigot. That is not sloppiness. That is another rule of the language. In Neapolitan, the final vowel of a word is very often reduced to almost nothing. Linguists write it with an apostrophe or with a small upside-down E because the sound does not vanish completely. It softens into a kind of breath, and something you feel more than you hear. Say it out loud. Mozzarella. Feel how the word closes. Every Italian-American family in the country did that with every word on the table for 3 generations, and every one of those families was told at some point that they were butchering the language. They were not butchering anything. They were carrying it. Here is something I would like you to sit with. In Naples today, that same softening is alive. In the market at Porta Nolana, in the streets behind the station, in a bar in the province of Avellino at 7 in the morning, you can hear a man of 30 do to a word exactly what your grandfather did to it in 1948. The language your family was mocked for is still being spoken right now today by people who never left. While we are correcting things, let me correct one more because it comes up in almost every Italian-American family and it is not true. Your name was not changed at Ellis Island. I know the story. Everybody has heard it. The clerk could not spell it or could not be bothered, and he wrote down something shorter, and that was that. And a family name that had existed for 400 years ended in a stroke of a pen. It makes a good story. It is a story about being small in front of a big desk, which is a real feeling, and I understand exactly why it lasted. But the inspectors at Ellis Island did not write down names. They checked them. The passenger manifest was written at the port of departure, Naples, Palermo, Genoa. It was filled out by the shipping company in Italy, by Italians, from documents the passenger handed over. By the time that sheet of paper reached New York Harbor, the name on it had already been written by somebody who knew perfectly well how to spell it. The inspector's job was to look at the man in front of him and confirm that he matched line 31 on a page that already existed. So where did the changes come from? They came later, and mostly they came from the family itself. A foreman who could not say it and so gave you a shorter one, and it stuck because you needed the job. A teacher who wrote it her own way on the school roll. A man who filed for citizenship and decided standing at that counter that his children were going to have an easier time than he did. That last one matters. In many families, the name was not taken. It was set down, on purpose, as an act of love, or of exhaustion, or of both. That is a harder story than the clerk at the desk, but I think it is a truer one, and I think the people who did it deserve to have it told correctly. There is a place I want to describe to you, and I go back to it often. The cemetery of a small town in Irpinia. They are usually just outside the walls, up the road, behind a low iron gate that is never locked. They are built differently than American cemeteries. Less lawn, more stone. Photographs set into the marble under little glass ovals so the faces look out at you. Small lamps that stay lit at night, so from a distance the whole hillside has a low red glow. And on those stones are the surnames. I have stood in cemeteries in that province and read names off the marble that I know for a fact are painted on the awnings of shops in New Jersey. Names that ended up on a bakery in Belleville, on a funeral home in Yonkers, on a construction company outside Providence, on a mailbox in a town in Ohio where the church still runs a festival in July. Same name, same province. Two branches of one family, one that stayed and one that left, and after 1920 or so, in most cases, they simply stopped writing to each other. Not because of a fight, because of distance, because of work, because the ones who stayed did not read and write easily, and the ones who left were busy becoming American. 2 or 3 letters a year became one at Christmas, then a card, then nothing. The branch that stayed is still there, the name is still on the mailboxes. The bar in the square still has 4 men in it at 11 in the morning, and one of them almost certainly has your last name. Let me take you down into the cellar, because that is where the meat actually became what it is. November. Always November or early December when the cold comes in and the air gets dry. That was when the pig was taken. 1 pig once a year and the whole family came for it. Nothing was wasted, nothing. The sausage was made the same day. The lard was rendered. The head went into a mold. The blood went into something depending on the province and the family. And the neck, that long marbled muscle, was set aside because that was the good one. It was buried in salt, days in the salt, sometimes a week or more, depending on the weight and depending on the cold. Then it came out and it was rinsed, often with wine, sometimes with vinegar, and it was rubbed down with cracked pepper. Then it was sewn into a natural casing and tied with twine in a spiral, wrist to wrist, tight enough to press the shape back together, and then it was hung. Not in a machine, in a cellar or in a cold room on the north side of the house, from a beam, with the window cracked open on the cold days and shut when the fog came up the valley. 3 months? 4? 5? If it was a heavy piece and the family could wait. Nobody had a thermometer. The knowledge lived in an old man's hands. He touched it. He smelled the room. He decided. And now, here is the part I want you to hear. When your great-grandfather got to America, he did all of that in a basement in Brooklyn, in a coal cellar in Philadelphia, in a garage in Cleveland with a window propped open in January. He did not have a hillside. He had a house on a street with trolley tracks. He hung the meat anyway. So how did the shame get in? I do not think it came from Italy. I think it came from school. Picture a boy in the 1st grade. He is 6. At home, the family speaks the language of the province, with English coming in around the edges. He walks into a classroom in 1931 and opens his mouth, and everything that comes out is marked wrong. Not just his accent, his name, his lunch, the smell of his coat. And a child learns very fast. He learns that the way people talk at his kitchen table is something to keep at the kitchen table. So he stops. And when he grows up and has children of his own, he speaks to them in English only. Not out of shame exactly, out of protection. He is doing the arithmetic that immigrant parents have always done. He thinks, they will get further than I did if they do not sound like me. That is why your mother understood the dialect but did not speak it. That is why you understand about 40 words of it. That is why your children know 4, and 3 of them are food. Nobody decided to throw the language away. It was set down, 1 generation at a time, by people who thought they were doing the right thing. And here is what I want to say to you about that, and I mean it seriously. The old man in the shop in Avellino, the one who ordered his slices and said the word almost the way your grandfather said it, has something you do not have. He has the language. But you have something too. You held on to a handful of words for 100 years, 3,000 miles from where they were born, with nobody teaching them, with no school, with no books, with everyone around you telling you they were wrong. They survived in your mouth because you would not let them go. That is not a small thing. That is what people do with something they love. Let me give you a few more of them, because once you have the rule, you have all of them. Cumpa. You knew it as Gumba. In standard Italian, it is compare. It means godfather in the baptism sense, and then it widens out to mean a man you are bound to. Not a friend, something with an obligation in it. Kumara, which came to you as Guma, the female version. Godmother, or the woman who stood beside your mother at every wedding and every funeral for 50 years. Menagia, that one survived almost perfectly. It comes from an old expression meaning, may it be cursed, and every family used it exactly the same way, for a stubbed toe or a lost war. Stunado, which you heard as stunad, it literally means out of tune, like an instrument, and it was used for a person who was not quite tracking with the rest of the room. Pasta e facile, which is what your family called it, and which is not a corruption of anything. In Neapolitan, beans are facile, not fagioli. Facile. Your family was saying it correctly in the language they actually spoke. Scarola, the bitter green, which came out of your grandmother's mouth as scarol and went into the soup at Christmas. And soppressata, the pressed salami, which every family I have ever met pronounced suppressad, and which is made from Sicily to Abruzzo with a different hand in every province. 6 or 7 words. That is what most families have left. But look at what those words are. Godfather, godmother, a curse, bread and beans, a green in a pot, the meat from the cellar. Of everything in a whole language, those are the words that made it across the ocean and down through 100 years. That tells you exactly what mattered. Now I have to be honest with you about one word on that list, and I want to be careful because I am not making fun of anybody. Manicotti. If you walk into a restaurant in Campania and ask for manicotti, they will not know what you mean. The dish exists everywhere in Italy, but it is called cannelloni. Manicotti, as the name of a food, was made in America. You will hear people say that as if it were an embarrassment. I do not think it is. Manica means sleeve. Manicato means a large sleeve, or a muff, the thing you put your hands into in winter. Somebody looked at a tube of pasta stuffed with ricotta, and instead of reaching for the word from the old country, reached into the language and pulled out a new one that fit better. That is not a mistake. That is a language doing the one thing a living language does. The same happened with 100 other things. Sunday gravy, which nobody in Italy calls gravy. Sicilian pizza in a rectangular pan. The 7 fishes on Christmas Eve, which is an American arrangement of a very old Italian habit of eating no meat that night. None of it is fake. All of it is what happens when a culture keeps living instead of stopping. A language only stops inventing words when the last person who speaks it dies. Your family kept inventing. In Newark, in Providence, in Chicago Heights, in New Haven, they kept making new words out of an old language in a country that had told them the old language was worthless. I would not apologize for one syllable of it. I want to come back to those hill towns one more time, because there is something you should know about what happened to them after your family left. They did not recover. Emigration took the young men first, and then the young women, and a town that loses its young does not shrink evenly. It hollows. The school closes, then the second bakery, then the bus comes twice a day instead of 6 times. And then on the 23rd of November 1980, just after 7:30 in the evening, the ground moved. The Irpinia earthquake was around magnitude 6.9. Close to 3,000 people died. Sant'Angelo dei Lombardi, Lioni, Conza, Laviano, Balvano. Towns your family would have known by name. Some of them lost a quarter of everything standing. Villages were rebuilt afterward, but often lower down near the road in concrete, and the old part, up on the ridge, was left. That is what I find when I walk up there now. Stone streets with grass in the joints, doorways with the lintel still carved, numbers on houses where nobody has lived since before your parents were born. Some of those doors belong to your family. I do not say that for effect. I say it because it is arithmetic. If your people came from a village in that province in 1905, the house they walked out of is very likely still standing, or at least its walls are, and a person can go and put a hand on it. That is one of the reasons I stopped being able to treat this as a food channel. You cannot walk through a town like that and then go home and film a recipe, so let me tell you how it is eaten there and how I think it should be eaten at your table. Take it out of the refrigerator well before. Cold kills it. The fat has to come up to the temperature of the room or you will taste nothing at all. 20 minutes, half an hour, sliced thin enough that you can see the shape of your hand through it. That is not showmanship. Thin is how the fat melts on the tongue instead of sitting there. On a wooden board, not a cold plate. Bread that can stand up to it. In Campania, that means pain caffone, the round country loaf with the dark crust and the open, chewy inside. The name comes from a word for a peasant, and it was not meant kindly when it started. They kept it anyway. Nothing on the bread, no butter, no oil, no dressing. The fat in the meat is the fat in the sandwich. That is the whole design. Then, if you want it the way the old people had it, 1 hard cheese, a few olives, and a glass of red. In Irpinia, that would be torrasi, made from the Aglianico grape, or a Fiano di Avellino if you want white, both from that same province. And that is all. No arrangement, no garnish, nothing rethought, nothing modernized. I am not going to tell you what any of this does for your body, because that is not what this food is. This food is not a program. It is a Sunday. I want to close with the thing that started all of this for me. When I was young, there was an old woman in my family who talked constantly about a place. She said its name 3 or 4 times a day. She talked about a road and a well and a man who kept goats, and I did not listen. I was 15. I had somewhere to be. She died, and about 6 weeks later, I understood exactly what I had done. I had been handed 100 years of a family, in a voice, in a kitchen, for free, and I had waited for her to stop talking so I could leave the room. You cannot get that back. I want to be honest with you about that. There is no fixing it. But here is the part that took me longer to learn. Not all of it went with her. The names are written down. The towns kept records, the parishes kept records, the shipping companies kept lists. Baptisms, marriages, deaths, going back in many parishes to the 1600s. Most of it survived the war, and a great deal of it survived the earthquake. There is more of your family sitting in a book in a stone building in the south of Italy than you probably imagine. If you want somewhere to start, I have put together a small guide, and it is free. It is the original recipes from the regions people actually left from, with the name of every dish in the dialect it came from and the province it belongs to. There is no charge and nothing to buy. The link is under this video. I made it because those names are the last handle most families still have on where they came from. Hold on to the handle. Now I would like you to do something for me. Somewhere in your family there is a town. It might be a town you have never seen. It might be a name you only ever heard your grandmother say out loud and never once saw written down. Put it in the comments. The town, the province, the region. Even if you are not sure of the spelling, especially if you are not sure of the spelling, because half the time the spelling in your family is closer to the truth than the one on the map. And tell me how your family said the word gabagool, gabagool, capicuollo. Every family bent it a little differently, and those small differences are not errors, they are fingerprints. They tell you which valley the sound came out of. I read them, all of them. And when I see a town I know, I will tell you what it looks like now, whether the church is still open, and whether your name is still on the mailboxes. Because it usually is. Your grandfather said gabagool, he was right.